My name is Carl Rogers. I'm going to stand so you guys can see me. I'm the Cultural Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy. So as part of my job, I coordinate the education programs between the two countries. I also am in charge of all of our cultural programs between the two countries, particularly the reconstruction efforts through the Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation. So you might have heard the weekend news of the octagonal Krishna temple in Kathmandu Square that just got started. Gadi Baitek will be finishing soon. Those kinds of projects I also do. But I will say my favorite project that I get to do is part of my portfolio is facilitating exchange between Nepal and the United States. So Nepalis who are going to the United States on some of our marquee programs, like the Fulbright program or the IVLP program, we have arts and culture programs that are in addition to that. I facilitate those, but I also get to work with American experts that we bring to Nepal in order to spark conversation. So one of the things that my office does with the help of Durga and others like him is we sit down and we try and figure out what are the issues that Nepal is facing right now and how can we help spark those conversations and contribute. And once we figure out what those topics are, we then go back to the United States and connect with our partners to figure out who those experts will be. And I will tell you today it was sort of a unanimous decision that Sam is an expert in looking at how data can help guide decision making on the responsible infrastructure, which we know is a pressing issue here in Nepal. So without further ado, I'm going to let her talk, but I want to say thank you to Martin Chautari to hosting us today. It's been an introduction to the space for me because I've only been on the job for 2 months. It's an inspiring space to see academics and media folks working hand in hand. It's truly good work. So thank you for doing it, and thank you for welcoming us today.
Thank you.
Here today. I feel already very relaxed in this room because many of you are researchers, and I also am a researcher. And many of you have worked in the public policy space, and I study public policy and deal with policymakers, so that is very familiar to me as well. And some of you students that are here, I love teaching and working with students, and so it's nice to have you as part of this conversation as well. So as was mentioned, I wanted to talk to you today. And talk is really more of a discussion and a conversation, I think, about responsible infrastructure development. I want to make sure that this is actually working. Yes, excellent. So as was mentioned at the start, I am part of a research project called AidData. We work with a lot of different partners, many governments, including the U.S. government. But I should say at the start that I am not a member of the U.S. government. I am an independent researcher. And so sometimes Carl will like what I say, and other times he'll be saying, oh, I don't agree with this at all. And that's okay, because I'm here to present this independent view. And so when I try to describe what I do for a living, my research project at AidData essentially tries to produce new data, tools, and analysis that all answers the question, who is funding what, where, and to what effect around the world. And so that is kind of the driving question for us at AidData, but I also hope that after today's conversation will be a driving question for you as well. And so when we talk about this infrastructure topic, I wanted to divide the conversation into 3 different parts. So first, starting at a global level. So this concept of infrastructure and infrastructure for development is something that is not unique to Nepal. Countries all over the world are grappling with these questions. And so what are some common principles and trends that we can think about and learn from at the global level? Then I wanted to move at the regional level. So in Asia Pacific specifically, there's a lot of hunger for infrastructure projects and a lot of challenges around how to make them sustainable, both from a financing perspective as well as from an environmental perspective. And so I'll talk a little bit about lessons learned from some of these other countries as well. And then finally, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking with you about the situation here in Nepal. What are some insights about how Nepal can think about responsible infrastructure investments? Some resources that are out there that you can use in your own media reporting and research to be able to follow the money. And then have a conversation together about what you think on these issues. So before we go too far into this, though, I wanted to take a moment to pause. So I put this title out there, Responsible Infrastructure Development, and I wanted to take a quick poll. So a couple of people, if you could just raise your hand and shout out, when you hear the words Responsible Infrastructure Development, what immediately comes to mind for you? And there's no right or wrong answer here. What do you think? Yes, please.
It's about having a sustainable, functional infrastructure. Because what I see at Nepal present is that it's very haphazard and it's more destroying than constructing.
Okay.
It's taking the money out of the country and not keeping the money in.
So it's sustainable, it's constructive, it's long-term, it's thoughtful. Okay, great. Other ideas? Yes, okay.
Well, it occurs to me that the title itself provokes a question. Do we have enough infrastructure? You see, without a hook, you cannot get a fish.
Yeah.
So do you have a hook in the first place?
Great. Very good. Yes, in the back, Brenna.
Yeah, without having to stand in one leg, how can the economic growth will be? Always you economists and European people emphasize only the broad market. But whenever the country, industry, agriculture will not be growth, to self-stand, how can economic growth will be there? This is my question.
Okay, so then coming back full circle to infrastructure and economic growth, and that's the name of the game. One more.
Yeah, so I guess just to describe what you were saying, the concept of distributed justice, so to make it sustainable, is everybody happy with it?
Yes.
Because if some people aren't happy with it, it will not be sustainable, so that goes beyond the environment,
Right.
I guess.
Exactly.
And so this trade-off between economic growth and inequality.
Yes. So growth that is not only more money for Nepal, but growth that is inclusive for all
everyone.
people
Yeah.
in Nepal. That's great. Well, I don't need to actually do any more talking. It sounds like you've got a good starting point already. But maybe I can add some additional ideas, and then we can discuss together. So, the name of the game here for this conversation is Infrastructure for Inclusive Growth and Sustainable Development, so themes that you've already talked about. And what we do know at the global level is that there's a chronic infrastructure deficit around the world. And there's a couple of challenges, I think, that we face when we're trying to solve this problem globally. So the first challenge is money. Infrastructure, if you're talking about physical infrastructure like roads and rail, or digital infrastructure like mobile technology or television, this is expensive. This is very difficult to do. The global estimate says that we'll need $6 trillion globally in investments in infrastructure around the world to be able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Are you familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals? This is 17 goals that the United Nations agreed to that cover governance, economic, social, and environmental issues. And low and middle income countries like Nepal will need $4 trillion annually to be able to achieve their infrastructure gap. But it's also important to recognize that when it comes to filling this chronic infrastructure gap, it's not just about money, it's also about governance, it's about strong institutions, it's about transparency, it's about openness and efficiency. We've seen from past research that well-governed countries have more infrastructure to begin with, but also that they save money by making their infrastructure more efficient and effective. And as a case in point, the most efficient countries in the world have gotten 2 times the economic growth benefits from their infrastructure than the least efficient. And importantly, if you take like the transportation sector, for example, the studies have shown that if you invest both in improving governance and increasing spending in the transportation sector, that's 6 times more effective in generating growth than just increasing spending alone. And so governance and spending go together. We talked a little bit about the fact that infrastructure development is not just about constructing buildings or constructing roads, but it's about achieving these sustainable development goals. And so at heart, that really means infrastructure to do 3 things. Infrastructure that improves access to basic services for everyone, infrastructure that spurs economic growth that is inclusive of all communities, and infrastructure that protects the environment through sustainable use of land, water, and other natural resources. And those are our barometer, or our measures of success, if you will, for infrastructure investments. But as you can imagine, it's very difficult to mobilize money and resources to support infrastructure. There's some challenges of market failures in countries like Nepal and around the world, where the private sector is unwilling to invest for various reasons. And some of the challenges that they typically cite are things like unfavorable or uncertain regulations, lack of transparency in terms of project investments, lack of viable funding models, and risk-adjusted returns, and then high development and transaction costs. And so what all of this means essentially is that there's a greater burden on governments to self-finance infrastructure, as well as to rely on foreign assistance dollars to do so as well. So when we think, though, about quality of infrastructure, as I mentioned, it's not just about money, it's about governance. And so the G20, the 20 largest economies, have come together with a set of principles for what quality good infrastructure means. And so I'll just highlight a couple of those quickly. So first is that good infrastructure maximizes economic, environmental, and social impacts for local communities. Second, that it ensures value for money and affordability across the entire life cycle of an infrastructure asset. So what that means in practice is that it's not enough to say, I can afford $5 million to build a road today, but how are you going to finance the long-term maintenance of this road tomorrow and the next day and the next day? And so thinking about the full life cycle of these things. It's also important, as was discussed before, to integrate social and environmental considerations when you're thinking about a new infrastructure project. So for all of the public goods that a road or a new energy plant can provide to a local community, there are also the potential for public bads. So pollution from an energy plant, displacement of local communities from their land, from a road project or a train project. And so when you're thinking about, should we make this infrastructure investment, it's not just enough to think about building something, but thinking about the total costs involved. Certainly in a place like Nepal, infrastructure that's resilient in the face of climate change and natural disaster is also critically important. I was in Los Angeles in the United States earlier this month, and if you are familiar with Los Angeles, you know that they too struggle with earthquakes. And so they think a lot about resilient infrastructure as well. And resilience means two things here. One is that, are you building infrastructure that will weather the storm, so to speak, that it will weather natural disasters? So if I build a bridge and an earthquake happens, will it survive? But more than that, can we use infrastructure like bridges to support our ability to adapt and to prevent or to adapt in the face of climate change? And so the city of Los Angeles is actually talking about putting sensors on their bridges and their electricity to be able to monitor the atmosphere and the changes in conditions to predict the next earthquake so that people can respond. And so that's an interesting way to think about resilience. And then finally, and in my mind, one of the most important principles to keep in mind is that infrastructure is also about governance. And I've said that a few times now. And there are a couple of things that we need to think about in terms of strengthening the governance that supports infrastructure. So that's open and transparent procurement processes, considering financial sustainability, and anti-corruption and accountability measures. I won't get too much into this, but it's important to also recognize that because infrastructure projects are big ticket items, they're very expensive, thinking about how we're financing these infrastructure investments is critical. And I would say that when you're thinking about financing choices, you're really talking about answering three questions. So first, in order to access this financing for infrastructure, if I access this money today, what will I need to pay tomorrow? And is it worth the cost? And so here you're thinking about concessionality, so interest rates and repayment terms, debt to GDP, these kinds of questions that mean, is this sustainable in the long term? A second critical question is, what do I need to promise in return to access this financing? And how does that factor into my cost-benefit calculus? So here there's three things that I would say are important. One is collateral. So by that I mean, does the funder need a guarantee in case I default and I can't repay? And so sometimes this is things like a hard physical asset, so Sri Lanka and a port, for example. It could also be a country that has natural resources or commodities like coffee or oil, and that is the collateral. Second is conditionalities. So does the funder require me to change my behavior in some way before I access this financing? And so, for example, many international donors will have corruption reforms that they want you to undertake in order to access financing. This has a benefit, but it also has a cost. And then finally, leverage. So will I owe the funder something in return as a quid pro quo down the road after I receive this financing? So the challenge with this, of course, is that a donor is saying to you, yes, I will give you money today, but I will come to you down the road with the expectation that you will fulfill a promise to me. The challenge being, I don't know what those what I'm going to be asked to do. The third critical question in my mind is also thinking about the transparency and accountability of these financing dollars to support infrastructure investments. So in other words, to what degree do donors make available information on the details of the terms of their investments, the progress of those investments, what the expectations are in return? And this chart behind me, you probably can't see the details, but you can see the red and the green. And essentially this means that donors vary in terms of the degree to which they are open and transparent about their investments. Traditionally, some of the large international organizations like the World Bank and the regional development banks are quite open and transparent. Bilateral actors like Germany, the United Kingdom tend to be fairly transparent. Some of the emerging donors are less so. So people like Saudi Arabia and China tend to be less transparent and open about their investments. And this is something to factor into account when you're thinking about how do I hold the government and the funder to account for results. So that's kind of a rapid fire look at the global level. I wanted to segue into looking at what's happening within the Asia and Pacific region when it comes to infrastructure and what can we learn from some of these actors. So what I would say in particular is that infrastructure at the start, we said, infrastructure, when I build a building, this should serve people, and people shouldn't be serving the building. And so infrastructure should serve our ability to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly things like clean water, affordable energy, industry and innovation, climate change, and sustainable cities. And so we know that countries like Nepal face large gaps in achieving the SDGs primarily because of this infrastructure gap. And so what are some of the other countries in the Asia-Pacific region doing about this, and what are they learning along the way? So I'll highlight first some of the bad news, the pitfalls that Nepal should be thinking about how to avoid. So countries have experienced that backdoor negotiations create opportunities for collusion and corruption that drive up the costs of infrastructure and decreases public benefits. And that actually one of the best things that governments can do is to open up the process of how they receive financing, which firms are actually tasked to implement these projects, and get the public involved in monitoring these things. Unfortunately, a lot of countries in the region have not done this, and so effectively you have places like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, Malaysia, and the Maldives that essentially have overpriced projects, unanticipated costs from delays, and a corruption tax, essentially, that rises up the costs of these things. We also see cases where an absence of competition has had negative spillover effects for domestic firms. An example of this was in the Maldives, where essentially the government had prioritized giving contracts for infrastructure projects to external firms. And then those external firms were then able to compete with domestic firms for domestic construction projects in the tourism industry. And so the private sector is saying, hey, you've essentially put us out of work because you've enabled these foreign firms to compete with us in a negative way. Another challenge here is this practice of circular lending. So circular lending basically means that if you have an external financier that says, yes, I will fund an infrastructure project in Nepal, but you have to use my firm from my country, and you have to use my labor, and you have to use supplies from my country. Essentially, that's smart from the donor's perspective, right? Because you can hedge your risk. You're dealing with all known actors. But the problem is that none of those benefits from those projects actually help the borrowing country. So in the case of Nepal, that means no local jobs. That means no firms that are actually able to generate profits from these partnerships. And suppliers are not benefiting either because they're not actually contributing to them. In addition to these backdoor negotiations, another pitfall to think about in the context of infrastructure are opaque deals and unforeseen costs. So essentially, when the terms and the amounts of investment are not open and available, that triggers instability, it increases the risk of corruption, and it reduces public trust. So we've seen instances in Malaysia and the Maldives and Sri Lanka, for example, where the government themselves often don't know what the terms are. So the Maldives recently had a political transition where a new government took power. And one of the first things they had to contend with when they took power was how much money do we owe to external donors? And they didn't know the answer to that question for quite a long time because of the lack of documentation. And of course, when it comes to the public holding the government to account, they actually have even less information to work with. And so, that is one of the major challenges. Also, collateral, so I talked about collateral before and collateralized lending. And this can actually be fairly substantial. So there's a case in Sri Lanka, for example, and they had external financing for a port investment that they ended up having to turn over to the external financier because they couldn't repay the debt. So those interest rates mounted up, it became unsustainable, and they had invested all of this money in a port that now they no longer controlled. I think that in the case of Nepal, you're not in a position quite yet where you're dealing with high levels of debt to GDP ratios, but there are other countries in the region that have experienced that. And often it's when the lending and the financing goes from grants to loans with market rates. And so that's actually a point of discussion here in Nepal. I know that for some of the new infrastructure projects you're talking about, you're thinking about possibly taking on loans rather than grants. And those loans have interest rates attached to them. And so that does increase the risk for you of rising debt to GDP. Another pitfall to avoid is how to ensure value for money and sustainability. So there are increasingly more complex financial instruments available to finance infrastructure. So one example of this is called syndicated loans, which I won't get into too much detail on this, but essentially think of it as bundling financing across multiple different banks and multiple different financiers. And so if you thought tracking financing from one institution was hard enough, think about trying to follow the money across all of those different institutions now. And so that's increasingly a problem in places like the Maldives. I think another challenge is that it's much easier to anticipate the upfront cost of an infrastructure asset than it is to anticipate the ongoing maintenance. And that also ties into the last point here, which is that countries around the region have struggled when they don't transparently engage in consultation with the private sector and civil society about what the priorities actually are. And an example of this is Malaysia. They invested quite substantially in ports, thinking that this would help fuel economic growth and support the private sector in terms of increasing transportation and connection to markets. The problem is that they kept taking on new loans for new port projects, but all of their ports are under capacity. So basically, there's more supply than demand for these ports, and so you're saddled with increasing amounts of debt and no actual revenues coming in because the ports aren't being used. Sorry, there we go. Nope. Did I go backwards? Yeah. Okay, so those were some of the hard points. Let's talk about some of the bright aspects of this, some lessons learned. So there are countries that are experimenting with ways to increase their leverage to get better terms from, in terms of financing for infrastructure. So one thing that countries are starting to do is making their procurement processes open and competitive, making sure that all of the people that are trying to bid on a new infrastructure project, they're making their bids public and open, and that encourages prices to go down, to be more competitive, and a better deal for the country. A second thing that I think countries are starting to experiment is diversifying their financing. It's very difficult. If there's only one source of financing available to you for infrastructure, you have to accept the terms no matter what, or no infrastructure. And so countries are saying, well, let me go out and actually find some alternative sources. And so Uzbekistan actually put a sovereign bond on the euro bond market, and Maldives has done something similar. And they said, well, it's not so much about increasing the amount of money for infrastructure, but now that we've attracted this private sector interest, I want to go back to my current funders and renegotiate terms and say, this is what the market's willing to give me. What are you willing to give me? And so that increased the leverage of the government. Another thing that countries have started to do is negotiating up front for foreign firms to use a minimum viable level of domestic supplies and labor. So this happened in Uzbekistan. The Maldives is starting to think about this too, where if a foreign firm wins an infrastructure bid, there's kind of a minimum level of local labor that they have to use, or local supplies. And that encourages a spillover to the local economy. One of my favorite lessons learned is increasing accountability through engaging citizens. So it's not just government's responsibility to ensure that infrastructure serves the people, citizens can have a role too. And so the Philippines is actually a really dynamic case study for this. So they developed a platform called Open Roads, which makes all information on current projects and investments in the road infrastructure sector publicly available. And so anyone, media, citizens, government officials can go to this platform and see, what is my community supposed to be receiving in terms of this infrastructure investment, and how are we doing? So seeing the actual original financing, who are the actors that are implementing these road projects, what is the current progress or status of these road projects. But then they also created an app called Route Shoot, which essentially you could use on your mobile phone, and you could go to your local community and find that road project that's supposed to be happening and shoot a video of the road and upload it via this platform. So essentially that video serves as the ability to verify, is this project happening? What is the quality of the road? And then that actually serves as a pressure on government and on the implementers that if progress isn't happening as it should, then there's actual proof that it's not. And then also, as part of that process, the Philippines has been experimenting with ways to engage citizens in the process of identifying what infrastructure priorities should be. It's a way around that problem that I mentioned earlier, where you're embarking on these costly investments and you're not seeing the demand. If you can engage citizens through what the Philippines calls bottom-up budgeting, so essentially having citizens weigh in on what the priorities for infrastructure should be, and then via a public platform be able to monitor, okay, so how is the government responding to this? How are they kicking in resources to these priorities? And what's the progress and the status? I'll also say that since I'm in a room with a lot of media and researchers, you have a role too in this process. And I'll share some resources in a little bit, but having journalists that use data and are interested in monitoring infrastructure projects also increases the scrutiny on these things. It helps ferret out things like corruption and helps create pressure on governments to progress. I think also engaging local academics to help think about what are those social and environmental and governance impacts on local communities. How do we make sure that vulnerable groups are benefiting? I think that's an important role that academics can play. So I wanted to kind of, in this final discussion section, talk a little bit about the situation here in Nepal as an opportunity to kind of get you talking about what you can do and what questions you have. So essentially, if I were to kind of assess the situation in Nepal, so we know that Nepal needs to direct 10 to 15% of its GDP annually towards infrastructure if it's going to graduate from LDC status by 2022 and put itself on a path to achieve middle income status by 2030. That's actually quite a lot of money. It's a big set of investments in infrastructure. And so my argument would be that to get the most out of each rupee spent and make sure that the infrastructure is positioning Nepal to achieve these goals, then we need to source financing wisely. We need to strengthen the institutions that govern these infrastructure investments. And we need to engage citizens in designing projects to maximize the benefits. There's a couple of other things that could be done across the board, thinking about excuse me, investing in planning processes that think about the total life cycle of infrastructure investments, and really making sure that excuse me, procurement processes are transparent and the financing is as well. I'm going backwards for some reason. Let's see. Okay. So let me actually pivot a little bit. There's many more recommendations and we could actually talk through that together, but let's talk about some of the resources that are out there for you. So one of the things that I always like to start with is following the money. So you can't hold governments to account for results if you don't know what the investments look like. There is a starting point here in Nepal. The Ministry of Finance publishes their aid management information system that actually has information from all of the donors on all of the foreign assistance investments they're making in Nepal. And so you can see that for various categories of infrastructure, for things like excuse me, energy, roads, railway projects, etc. Sorry, let me just take a glass of water. So it's a starting point to get familiar with what's out there. But the challenge is it's not very detailed. There's not much information beyond that. Another important part of the puzzle is looking at what emerging donors are doing. And so actually AidData produces the world's largest database on Chinese official finance investments around the world. And because China is a big financier of infrastructure at the local level, and looking at forest cover change over time. So taking satellite imagery that takes pictures of forests over a time period, you can actually assess whether and how infrastructure investments are changing the way that forests are growing. And so what you can see here is the before and after pictures. So before these infrastructure projects rolled out and afterwards. And what you see is a mix. So in some cases in red, you're seeing that infrastructure projects are having negative environmental outcomes. And then in other cases, it's a little bit better. And one of the critical differences we found is the quality of local governance in terms of mandating protections for those forest assets. And you can do the same thing with economic growth as well, using nighttime lights. And so actually monitoring projects to see if you build a road, how far is the influence of that road in terms of triggering economic growth. So I think I have done a lot of talking, and I think that given the fact that there's a lot of experience and interest in the room, I'd love to hear your reactions and questions and keep the conversation going. So thank you so much.